material, but that doesn't mean we don't have to add a different form of the signage. So I'll be working with this team this week on that.
My concern is that, and it's just an observation, that now that the sign has moved and that lane is open, the traffic is just turning and going up Church Street and continuing through the
LED sign.
Right.
Okay.
At least the sign blocked that lane, and for the most part, most vehicles didn't try to traverse the next lane on Church Street, especially if a vehicle was there, as Scott said.
Okay.
I've had that happen too, one coming out, and other people as well, going south on Church. But now that the sign's gone, people are just turning up.
Okay.
It's an open lane and they're just going up.
So for December 13th, would you like London in attendance so we can, I think we need to come back to you with some options. The snow plowing issue is going to be a
Right.
concern that we have to deal with. But if you want to have a conversation about keeping that travel lane closed, would you like him at that meeting?
Well, I understand the issues and concerns with the snow. Once it starts snowing and there's heavy snow and sleet and things like that, the lane has to be open. But
now that it hasn't, would you like it back for now?
yeah.
Okay.
If it's not snowing and there's not a reason to have it closed,
Right.
then we should have it closed. I think. That's my own personal observation, but the sign at least defeated the purpose of turning up and turning up onto Church going north. Okay. And the cars were at least continuing down the road and either turning up on north or continuing the detour.
Okay.
But
Okay.
Yeah, but I agree with you. I don't know. I think we do need a solution that's either flexible between snows or something different. I don't know what that is. I do wonder, you mentioned the large LED sign. I do wonder if what's on there, maybe we can tune that language somewhat. I don't know that someone who's following GPS who's not from here, bridge means anything to them, right?
Right.
While that context makes sense to us, the bridge is out or bridge is closed.
Right.
It doesn't really convey, don't turn right, the road's closed for, through traffic, as the road closed signs seem to be more effective at, right? So I don't know if there's a way to change that message that might help.
Absolutely. Let's try another.
No right turn,
Yeah, let's try a new message.
I don't know, not a throughway, I don't know. And I don't know that the motorists, the predominant, out-of-town motorists that are turning, know it's even Church Street. So I don't know that naming it helps either, but maybe some other way to convey not to turn there.
Okay.
Could be helpful. I don't know for sure, but it could be.
Can't hurt to try.
That's all we can do right now, I guess, right? So, yeah,
Okay.
I'd say, yeah.
So I'll work with the team on that, and then I'll ask Glenn to be here for the 13th so we can talk about it.
Okay. Yeah. Obviously, coordinate with public safety on any concerns about what we are or aren't going to do and how that fits in. Anything else in that area for the moment?
no.
Okay. Next item is review of the Arch Street forced sewer main change order requests.
Nothing new for today.
Excellent. Next up is meeting minutes for November 1st, 2021.
Make a motion to approve minutes from November 1st, 2021 as printed.
Second.
Any discussion?
None.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Meeting minutes from November 15th, 2021.
Make a motion, we accept the meeting minutes of November 15, 2021 as written.
Second.
Any discussion there?
None.
None.
All those in favor?
Aye.
And last, meeting minutes November 16th, 2021.
Make a motion, we accept the meeting minutes of November 16th, 2021, as written.
Second?
Any discussion with those?
None?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The next item of business, review of the former International Paper Mill request for interest submissions.
It's quite the read, huh?
It was.
It is, it is. Welcome, Mariah. Excuse me.
So I think Mariah spent probably more time reviewing the document and can probably speak to more of the details if you have those. But just on the high level, we've conducted your RFI process. We did the multiple site visits. We responded to questions. The deadline was November 17th. It's not mandatory for the RFP process to respond to the RFI. It's always been optional. But there was at least one official response that you received, and then you received one unofficial response. It does seem that you have several firms interested. What was, I think, interesting to the both of us is that this is the first time we've conducted an official process, but this is the first time we've had residential reuses suggested. All prior conversations have been commercial or industrial. So that was an interesting change to the way that we've been approaching this project. So I'll leave it there for now.
And just in general, we received one formal submission, right, from, excuse me,
Community builders?
Community builders, yep. And then an informal response from Rural Development? Is that right?
RDI.
RDI, yep, Rural Development, okay. There was a lot there to digest, and I know we're going to talk a lot more about this. It's not a one-night review, but any initial questions or thoughts? Or Mariah, did you have anything in summary you got out of that you wanted to highlight?
I think, like Brian said, the biggest thing is that both proposals were residential, which was, we expected it after we had seen who showed up at the site visits, but prior to that, I would not have guessed that they would both be residential. I would have guessed more commercial, industrial. Also in the same range of units, so I believe the community builders proposed 60 units, and RDI proposed 40, so not too far off from each other. Wildly different proposals on what buildings they thought they would keep. So the community builders thought they would keep Building 2 and Building 8, and ultimately build another building adjacent to Building 2 as kind of a second phase of their project. Rural Development, Inc., they were proposing keeping Building 7A, 7B, 4A, B, E, F, like a whole slew of buildings, also including Building 2, with most of that being housing and some commercial. And because they did not have a formal proposal, they were less specific about what space would be used for what. I think those were the biggest things. Both proposed affordable units and potentially having a mix of market rental units added in. And potentially some condos for sale in the RDI proposal. It was interesting that both parties thought that Building 8 could be used. And I think both, I don't know if RDI was specific about it, but both had vague ideas of just having amenities there. Like they just thought that it was an interesting place that they would want to capture, which was just interesting. As we've been touring it, there was a lot of interest in that building. No one knew exactly what would go there, but they all liked it.
Somehow.
Yeah.
When I toured it a couple of years ago, that was the same thing. Is there's something about it.
Yeah.
Developers want that building.
Yeah, I think the other thing was that there was a large interest in how close the river is and how kind of tucked away the complex feels. As we were touring it, there was a lot of comments about that, of not wanting to kind of impede the view of the river or kind of access to it. The community builders proposal included a Riverwalk idea, where in phase 1, they would do kind of one section of it, and in phase 2, connect it kind of beyond building 8 and kind of wrap around, which was something that Brian and I had talked about prior, which we enjoyed seeing. The idea that that space could be both recreational and an amenity to whatever development goes there, I think is very interesting. It could be open to the public to just go walk or bike or whatever. And I guess lastly, just the financing. RDI didn't include specific finances, but they did say that they wanted to use federal and state historic tax credits and low-income housing tax credits. The community builders had a much more specific breakdown, actually I think more specific than we would have expected in a conceptual proposal, that listed, mortgages and mass housing workforce loan, state soft funding, MassWorks grant, several other sources of funding. So I think I'll leave it at that for the actual RFI, but the next few agenda items are kind of all interwoven with this.
Sure. And I do recall, I don't know, Bill, I believe you were on, Scott, I don't recall if you were, we had Ty and Bond do some work, do like a market study down there. I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago, maybe longer. And mixed use was a lot of what they talked about in that. And that was probably the last time, because we've leaned more in the commercial industrial since. So, interesting. Any questions, comments from the board so far? I mean, it's a lot there.
I think it's really encouraging, and I'm concerned that on a couple of fronts, that one, we were looking at Care Drive for senior housing, and folks are now looking at the IP building for senior housing, which we had thought about originally, but it was too large and too big and had too many issues and concerns for it to be a viable site for the committee. My other concern would be that strictly housing, whether it's affordable and or units for sale, impact our community as a whole. It impacts our police department. Calls will increase. You'll need to put more officers on. It means more kids going to the elementary school. It can just balloon our services, and so that's a concern. And I think it's something that we should think about. At least have a really good idea of how it is going to impact our community. This was probably going to happen anyways, because that's why we had a committee to look at it. But there is an impact to our services, and so we need to look at it. And then I know we're working on bylaws, and would this be something of this size and nature? Would this be a special permit? What would be the process for that?
So usually, yes, there would be a review process. The Planned Unit Development Overlay District that you all kind of have been reviewing and that the Planning Board had a special hearing on could be an option for this if residents vote that they would like to see that happen. That would be an option for this developer to use some of those tools. Otherwise, there would be probably a site plan review process, which would encompass like the entire project.
Okay. So those are my that off the top of my head issues that I can think of that I have some concerns with. But I am encouraged by the proposals, and if that's the way we're going to go, I'm for it. The building has to have something there. Something has to happen. So. I'm in favor of that happening. So.
Something.
Something, whatever that is.
Progress.
It was exciting to see that people were
Right.
interested.
And I did see that some people did talk in a much smaller way about some commercial aspect of that. So, and that's encouraging as well. So.
And maybe I read it differently, and there's a lot to pour through, and I need to read it, through a couple more times. But on the senior housing piece, I got from the community builders, I got the feeling that was more of the phase 2, a new building that they would add.
Right.
Could be that, but it could be
Right.
commercial industrial
Right.
to either complement or add something else to the community beyond the housing in the first building.
Yeah.
Right.
Which sounded good to me, and maybe I just kind of skimmed over the senior housing piece, knowing we have a different direction for that. Knowing we didn't feel like that, at least the senior housing committee hasn't felt like that was a good site, for
Right.
that plan.
One thing I would, go ahead, sorry.
I think the other things that appealed to me was the economics of it. It was nice to see economics that they thought worked at
Yeah.
$30 million, but had a design to get there. And I'd have to read it in more detail again, but it sounded like that was over the first year or two, or the first 5 years, including the 3-year construction,
Right.
calendar, if you will, from start to finish. So it seemed pretty likely that it would, could happen, and that there could be success for them or other interested parties to make this happen. I know historically we've looked at $10 to $20 million demo costs and went, how will we ever get over that hurdle to something that has economics that makes sense for a contractor or an interested developer? So I think for me, that was maybe one of the biggest things, was just seeing numbers that they put down on paper that they said, this works. And I'm like, okay, great. And then the low-income housing, knowing that that's something that we have a gap on in our town. And while I completely agree that housing, has an increased cost, or increases the necessary services that we have to provide, or the burden on those services, I think thoughtfully, that doesn't mean it's not the right decision, like you said. So
I agree. Right.
I was just going to, a couple of questions. I was a little surprised that it was predominantly residential. And they were the only 2 walkthroughs, correct?
The only 2 people that attended?
Yeah.
No, there was other folks
There
who
were other?
attended.
Okay.
I think there was maybe 2 or maybe even 3 other groups that attended.
And the conversation with them, informal conversation, were they leaning more towards commercial industrial?
They
No,
didn't say.
they
I
didn't
think
say.
one group was specifically a demolition contractor, or kind of the kind of company that kind of gets information and distributes it to contractors.
Okay.
I don't know off the top of my head if there were other folks there, or what they were associated with.
Yeah, the only reason I ask is, if we use the one formal and one informal to, formulate our opinion on how we move forward with an RFP, and we put it out there for something that is tailored to residential like we saw, and not knowing that information, that maybe there are a half dozen other contractors out there that would have bid on it if they could put in a commercial, but not hearing from them, we don't have that information. So that was a little concerning, because I think the site does lead to a mixed use. It does lend itself to a mixed use well, but I'm happy with the proposals, the RFI that we saw, the 2 of them. And I will echo, while I know increases in our residents within the town does have an impact to all the services. The school, that's debatable of how much of an impact it has because their numbers are pretty low compared to what they've been over the last decade anyway. So there's capacity there to, even if 60 residences had, 50% of them had children, I think you still have capacity in that school to take them in. But, 60 to 80 new residences, while there is an impact, we knew that, we have this building, we have the former graded school, we're looking at increasing tax base, we're looking at increasing housing, we need to get our affordable housing, low-income housing in the town beefed up. So we knew this was coming, so we need to plan for it, but not shy away from it. So that, just looking at it holistically of what are the impacts, what's going to happen, and study that a little bit so that we can be working alongside with our public safety as the developers are developing their buildings. But all in all, I'm excited to actually have what feels like actual movement. It's been a decade or more of talking about what can we do with this building. We have to do something with it. So happy to see it. Thank you for all your work on it, both of you.
You're welcome.
Agreed.
If I can I respond to it?
Yes, go ahead,
To those
Maria.
comments? One of them being that you had talked about the senior housing that we had previously spoken about being on Care Drive. Right now, because our affordable housing level is so low, a developer could essentially come in and propose a project where they kind of are allowed to do whatever they want. And we do not have control if they appeal to the state and say that because the community's levels are so low that they can come in and do this process. If we had affordable housing in the IP mill, that we are in control of the process through this RFP, and then later on we wanted housing here at Care Drive, if I don't know specifically with these numbers proposed where that would land us in our percentage, but we moved towards a number that is acceptable by the state and shows that we're making progress. And so it would potentially prevent a developer from coming in and doing a 40B process where the town has no control over what is happening there. And it also, I guess maybe 6 months to a year ago, we had spoken with a few developers and folks at the state about whether we would even be allowed to have senior-specific affordable housing. And the answer was most likely not, because we had almost no general family affordable housing that's open to anyone of any age. So if we had general family affordable housing at the IP mill, it could then lend itself well to, balancing out senior housing over here. It may make those numbers work a little bit better for our town.
I also just want to add to that the respondents that you have are very much clearly aware that you've been trying to work on the senior housing project for the last 20 years. And during our site walks, asked about that, the status of that project, somewhat even being surprised that we had put that on hold while we were working on these two sites. And obviously, once they saw the facilities, they realized why we were trying to move on these buildings as opposed to the development of a vacant parcel right now. But they haven't lost interest in being part of that proposal in the future. So if senior housing was incorporated into this project, I think that potentially could be part of the solution that you've all been looking for a while. But there was a question at every site walk about when are we ready to put the RFP back out for senior housing on Care Drive, and talking about the neighborhood that you've created here, the services that you have here. So I wouldn't say that just because a proposal has come forward that talked about maybe trying to meet your senior housing goals, that this project is now off the table. I think they're interested in talking to you about all of these things. For whatever reason, you have a lot of interest right now in Irving, and these developers want to be part of that process.
Yeah, I'm not sure that either proposal would meet the need that Irving currently has for senior housing. I don't think there was enough in there to satisfy that. There'd be definitely a need for a second location, without a doubt.
I will say, I'm a little surprised that RDI had less units reusing majority of the buildings versus community builders
Yeah.
keeping one and having more units. That math seemed odd to me,
They-
just a little bit, but
They had kind of an asterisk at the bottom
Okay.
that, I don't know if I included it in the summary, but basically saying they included a lot of what they called traffic flow space. And it was because they don't know the exact configuration. They like included a huge buffer. I think it was like 11,000 square feet or something.
gotcha.
Or 32,000 square feet perhaps. And my guess is that that could potentially be worked into the actual number of units. Because the community builders was talking about basically building two and then creating their own building. You can be a lot more efficient if you're building your own space from scratch. That was my interpretation of that.
That makes sense, but I thought initial counts were 60 versus 40-ish, and so
It could be.
without, yeah. But either way,
they-
this is obviously early concept stuff, so
Yeah,
not to be critical, just surprised.
Right.
I'm also not sure if they included 3 bedrooms in the community builders, whereas RDI, I think, was including 3-bedroom units. So it could be less units, but some larger ones?
Yeah, RDI definitely had some 3-bedrooms, some larger units.
Yeah. The other thing was, Scott, you talked about having, not wanting to limit like RFP that we put out to just residential. I think that's a very pertinent comment here because we have 2 residential proposals, or mostly residential proposals. Brian and I had that same conversation of how do we then inform the rubric so that you're not limiting yourselves just to residential.
Right.
Because just because these are the developers who came out to the site visits and, displayed interest in the RFI process, as we noted before, there's really not a benefit from going through the RFI process other than offering the town information so that we can then craft our rubric and giving them the opportunity to assemble a team and kind of start the process. But because they don't actually get a building or land out of this, you might find that there's developers out there who were waiting for the RFP to respond.
That was, that was my
So
concern.
I completely agree. I think that we have to be careful as we move through crafting the RFP that, if you all decide that you want residential to be your focus, obviously you can move in that direction. But if you want to be open-minded to other options, I think it's going to take some tweaking of the rubric to kind of figure out how we do that.
Yeah, I think, we've said in previous conversations that we were always envisioned that property being more of a commercial industrial and a willingness to entertain residential. Seeing these RFIs that came through, I would say carefully crafting that rubric is important to know that no matter what shows up through the RFP, that we have a way to assess it for viability in the town. So whatever, and not limiting it. So.
Well, I agree. I wonder if, I'm thinking, when I've been conceptualizing this a little bit, is at least in the guidelines of what we put out when we get to the RFP is really high level about, what buildings need to stay, if any. For example, what general, guidelines we don't want these buildings to exist after, like, personally just say, like, building 1, I guess you'd call it, in the very front. To me, that should go in any proposal.
Right.
And then some guidelines about what makes sense to us within the different uses. But I think when we get to the rubric, that is going to be a little more challenging to not weight something that we've seen in these proposals, these heavier than maybe a different use that we'd also consider. So,
on that
yes.
Jack, no, in the next conversation after, we have a site readiness conversation to have first, but then after that, the conversation is your next steps for your RFP. I think the consideration the 3 of you need to weigh, what are the components, and I think you were addressing this, what components are the must-haves, the things that are the floor, so that would end up in your programmatic design, and on the rubric would be that's the floor to get even into consideration, right? And then what would you consider advantageous at each of those next levels? So if we have a 5-column rubric and the bare minimum is not advantageous up to very highly advantageous, is the bare minimum 10% commercial has to be included. And that's something that you can set, and I'm just making up that number, but you can call out a specific attribute. If it is to be affordable housing, is there a specific floor in affordable housing? And when the Senior Housing Committee was working on their RFP that they presented to you all, they proposed a minimum number of affordable housing units. So you can put those floors in. The caution with that is if you shoot too high, you could chill the response interest from potential developers if they feel like their proposal wouldn't be considered as advantageous. So if we can find the right balance, but if you feel really strongly about at least a particular component of mixed use, there's no reason that you can't put it in there and be as clear as you're talking about. And then we can further incentivize through the rubric. If you'd like to see higher levels of that, that could be rated highly advantageous. But you may get a proposal that doesn't rank high in that category, but they check all the other boxes, and so therefore they become the most advantageous proposal. There's a few ways to get where you may want to go.
I think when I think about what you're saying, the challenge that comes to mind for me is to ensure that we give maybe equal weight or equal advantage to mixed use commercial industrial versus primarily residential. I think of a box that says, it's X amount of low income housing and housing units, or create so many jobs in commercial industrial. How do we have an or so that you can get a win in that column either direction, or you end up with just kind of throwing numbers out there, 5 criteria that are advantageous for housing and 5 criteria that are advantageous for commercial industrial mixed use, and you can rate on one or the other, but you're unlikely to be able to hit both sides. So you can win here or win here to
Right.
present a successful proposal.
And that's-
I guess those are the two things that keep going through.
That's the one that I was leaning towards is when we're crafting that rubric to understand that one developer may excel in a subcategory of the rubric and not meet criteria in others, and then vice versa, a different developer would hit a different point. So really parsing those out instead of doing an and or in the same box, giving each type of development its own category, and that way, depending on what we see, we can at least you'll be able to get a number that can compare when we flesh it all out and assign those numbers through the rubric. While they might be different, they could still have a high ranking if what they're bringing to the table still meets what the town would like to see.
Right. It'd be ideal we had some 80-something ranked residential use and some 80-something ranked.
Right, and then we get to
Commercial,
decide
industrial, and then we
on
just
which,
have to
which
really
avenue do we want to go down. They
decide
both
the
rank well.
best
They're
one.
both really well thought out proposals, vastly different. Now we get to decide which way do we want to see the town go,
Right.
and what makes the most sense for us. So.
Tangent sort of to this topic, we met with Mass Development, and I know that's going to segue eventually into this next topic, but I had a chance to talk to our Brownfields program manager when we did that cleanup 2 years ago. And as you all recall, we have a lien on the property for the cleanup, and it's an economically driven lien, and it's very generous terms to the town. I asked them if it was necessary to craft in this RFP a floor in terms of sale price so that we can try to make good on that. And they encouraged us just to do what's right for the town and not worry about a floor price. They recommended actually not doing a floor price unless you felt that was important. They did not encourage us to do that and just go forward with what makes the most sense for the town, which I thought was pretty encouraging, knowing that they've had our back on this project so far.
Excellent.
That's good.
Would you like me to go through and summarize the conversation with Mass Development as it's kind of
Around the site readiness?
Yeah.
It's soon, but yeah, I mean, do you guys want to go there now, or do you
Sure.
want to talk about the
Yeah,
RFP
I mean, we're on the
after?
same-
All right, why don't
same
we?
topic.
Yeah, I mean, it all kind of is.
Yeah, it all
We'll kind of
intertwines.
move into the discussion regarding the mass development site readiness
Okay.
grant.
So back in the spring, we applied to the One Stop program for several grants, and we were offered two. One was the zoning grant, and then the second one is one that we've been offered but are still kind of negotiating with Mass Development. And Brian and I met with them last week to talk about this. The grant is for $600,000 of site readiness money, which would be used for selective demolition. And that scope is flexible. We proposed a scope that Ty and Bond had drafted for us, which did demolition kind of along the access road that we were proposing to make space for that. When we met with Mass Development, there was a lot of really good conversation, and we deliberately planned the meeting for right after we got the interest responses. And they were very intrigued by the responses that we got, but their grant program is really geared towards commercial industrial use. It can be mixed use with residential, but they basically said there's no specific formula, but it should be more commercial residential, or more commercial industrial, than residential. So they were a little bit hesitant about that. We explained the same thing that we've all just been talking about, which is this is the first time we've had residential interest, and they understood that. They are willing, the group that we spoke to are going to talk to the rest of their team and see how long they can hold on to that funding for us, so that if we want to try to pursue this RFP process, because I had a lot of anxiety about saying, no, we're not going to take your money in the hopes that this works, and then what happens if something doesn't work out? And they understood that, but cautioned us not to worry about that as much, but are going to look into whether they can hold on to that money as we go through the RFP process, and then if we need the site readiness funds, it's available. So they're going to research that. The Brownfields funding that Brian was just talking about, the $200,000 grant we received in 2018, we thought was required to be fully repaid if we offloaded the building in the next however many years. It turns out that it is only required to be repaid if we receive gross proceeds larger than the amount that we have expended on upkeep and redevelopment, which is unlikely that we would ever receive that amount of money because we've spent a lot. And we haven't calculated exactly what that number is yet, and we will. But in all likelihood, a developer is not going to pay us very much money for this building, and the benefit to us is reducing blight and having jobs or residences, which is good news in the fact that we will probably not have to repay the $200,000 or request that a developer repays us to repay them. And then the site readiness funding is not tied to a fiscal year. So if we did decide to use this funding, say the RFP process doesn't work out for whatever reason, they're able to hold on to it for us, we could potentially use it to do selective demolition, and then in the future move forward with an RFP process again in the future. I think that's most of it.
I was just going to
Go
say,
ahead.
but by utilizing it in that aspect, if we are on hold with an RFP and we're taking their 600 to do some selective demolition, we're then saying that we're going to go with commercial.
Correct.
So just there's that
Well,
caveat.
It can be
Can they
mixed
firm up
use.
how
right.
how binding is that? Because that's what you're getting at. Because
Right.
if we do that
and
prior
2 years
or
later,
during an RFP and we don't have a determination on which use we're going to do, and the most viable options that are presented are primarily residential, let's say not even mixed or much mixed, then how does that play out, right?
Yeah.
Like, how does
Yeah.
that play out? Not that I think all had voiced interest in heading more mixed commercial industrial, but if that's not what is the viable presentations or viable proposals, then
Right.
then what?
Right. And they didn't have a specific answer for that. It was nice speaking with them because they are flexible and they understand that these projects are not cookie cutter, and they do a lot of these projects. But it's also challenging because it's not a yes or no answer. And so it kind of seemed, the way they presented it was that if we ended up using this funding, they would want to see our rubric reflect priority towards commercial industrial.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Whether or not that's the response that we get, I think they would want to see the town push for that, and the results are the results, but that's really their aim. Maybe it's a requirement for a certain amount of commercial or industrial use, I'm not sure, but I think they would bake that into whatever our contract is, that in the future, if you offload this property, there is X amount of commercial use required.
So for me, that leads to two questions. One is, can we get maybe a more firm answer? And understanding that it's flexible, but to use your term, what's the floor or the ceiling? How flexible is it, right? Is it flexible enough that we can say that we prefer that maybe and show some priority in a rubric, but that's it? Or is there a minimum that we have to say is required, or it's not even
Right.
viable? And the second is, we're already talking about how long can we kind of put this on pause and have the funding available still. Can we use this as an incentive in the RFP process, potentially, for a developer that is proposing something in the same vein, that we can secure them $600,000 of town support for their proposal to help with the economics?
Right.
That's just something we should know.
That was one of your questions that you asked, and neither of them responded directly to it. But if you look in the summary that I did, in the financing section for the community builders, they included their sources, and one of their they also have the breakdown of the uses, and so they had $3.7 million for site work and about $19 million for construction, and they had $3.7 million in a MassWorks grant. So that leads me to believe that they're thinking they're going to get a MassWorks grant to do site work there. We don't know if they're thinking that money would cover all demolition that they need to do. So it doesn't go into specifics. But that was something that Mass Development looked specifically at to see what the developers are thinking they're going to need for funding to do demolition. I don't know.
Fair. Fair. I'm just thinking, as we talk about a rubric and an RFP,
Right, can we use that
is
as a
this something
carrot?
we can incentivize, right? And potentially incentivize the developer towards more of a mixed use or more of a commercial industrial preference, because we can help them secure some public funding to help beyond what they already have access to.
We did ask if they had any examples that they could share with us of an RFP that was done on a project, either one that they did just as a mass development project or one that they did with another public entity, another town, that maybe align more with this mixed use concept that we've been talking about, that was open to a residential, something that they funded, something that would go along with their programmatic goals themselves. And so we have not received that yet. They said they'd look. They couldn't promise that they had one, but they did at least offer to go back through their files and see if they could identify something that may help us. So the conversation is going to continue, and to Mariah's point, they've been very collaborative in the sense that they were excited for you all and the responses that you got. We didn't know how to gauge, is this a good number of responses? They've done the RFP process where nobody responds. So they thought you had a great response, and they also were excited for you that regardless of it being housing or commercial, the idea that this property could be back to productive use in a few years was just in general a good thing for the town. So to know that Mass Development is rooting for you, whether you choose to take their money, whether this development works for that money or not, they're still rooting for you all to see this to fruition.
Yeah, just one last thing on the RDI informal proposal. I really did like how they have a lot of use of the property, use of the space for artwork, for different items. And the reason I say that is its proximity to Miller's Falls and you have all sorts of updating that they're trying to do. You've got O'Bear Construction doing all sorts of work and trying to revitalize certain areas. You just had a new business come in with Rustic Romance in Millers Falls. So you've got a little bit of growth in a neighbor town that's a quarter of a mile away, right across the tracks and right across the river. And so it sort of lends itself nicely to having something in the arts, some sort of studio space or something like that in there as well. I think that would, work well.
They proposed keeping the shell of a few buildings as kind of a walking architectural history tour, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah.
Then you can add in art displays and things like that.
Yeah.
It can be very fluid. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Brian.
just to build on what Scott was just referring to, a lot of the conversations that Mariah's been engaging in with the town of Montague and their planning office is how do we keep building the synergy between what their efforts have been over in Millers Falls. These factories went along with the downtown, so it only makes sense that if we can tie some of our efforts with some of their efforts, it's only going to help both towns. So we are trying to do this in concert, even if they're all separate projects.
Right.
So we're going to keep that cohesive conversation moving forward. And I think we've had those conversations with potential developers walking the project. So when we're officially doing the RFP process, we will continue to have that conversation about the efforts in Montague, what we're doing in Irving side, how the two sides really work together, and that we're really looking for proposals, one, that complement that effort, but two, also for proposals with a developer who wants to work with the town. We want this to be a partnership, not just an out-of-town entity that doesn't want to be part of our community.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, specifically I was talking about the live workspace for young professionals, where they have that live workspace, and it reminded me of the OIC, Orange Innovation Center, who just did that revitalization of that building and did a community workspace that can be a shared workspace. So just an interesting use of an old building.
Anything to add to that one?
Nope.
Okay. I think, $600,000 towards this project keeps adding into funds that we can move that project forward and progress, and that's exciting. But I think we don't know what to do with it yet, or if it fits, right? And not that we don't have work to do there. I think every proposal has some demo. I think the challenge we've all gone back to is which is the right demo, and how much shoring is required if we do demo if it's not in conjunction with the project kicking off, as opposed to kind of an isolated project. So, look to hear more on how flexible they are, what options we have, and how long we might be able to keep that available in our toolkit to moving forward.
okay.
As we move into the next topic, which is discussing the former International Paper Mill RFP and how we form all this information into something that then becomes the RFP.
Back in July, you saw a rough draft, and then we decided to go down the RFI path. So we've just put that draft on hold. We're going to dust that off.
Okay.
We wanted to hear what was sort of coming to the surface for the three of you, so we can do our best to update that draft. And the thought is that we'll bring it to you for December 13th. If we have some examples of some grading rubrics that we think start to address some of the things that I've heard you talk about, we'll bring those forward. I think tentatively the goal is we would like to get something put together that you all feel strongly about issuing for the end of January, which is not a huge timeline. But if we're trying to sort of work with the loose understanding of the time frame that Mass Development has, how long maybe they can hold this money for us, if you want to get responses back March, April, so that we have a sense of whether or not this procurement was successful, we probably should try to make a little progress on it. So again, the template is ready to go. We really just need to refine your programmatic goals and really refine that rubric. As you discussed, that's probably going to be the driving issue, I think, for having a successful procurement. If we go too heavy in one direction, we really could disincentivize somebody from responding. So is the 13th a reasonable time frame to bring it to you?
Is it a reasonable time to update it from what you've heard tonight.
Brian and I have a meeting set for next Friday to sit down and really dive into this. I think we can definitely bring you a draft. I think you're all going to have comments. We're going to have comments. I don't think it'll be by any means a final draft. There's people that we can reach out to kind of get feedback on the rubric. I think the conversation that you've all had tonight about even kind of separating out the residential from the commercial and trying to even those out, that's helpful to hear. Yeah, I think we can do that and then see where we stand. And we can always adjust the timeline if needed. Like Brian said, the hope is to maybe release it at the end of January or beginning of February, which would get us to them being due at the end of March or beginning of April. And then you'd probably want a couple meetings to review those before you make a final decision. And then it's a lot of contracting and legal stuff beyond that.
Right. Okay.
Brian, I know I have it somewhere in an old email, but could you resend me the rubric
Absolutely. Yep.
just as it stands today?
Yep.
Thank
Send
you.
it to all of us,
Absolutely.
if you would. Are we in agreement that that is rubric-wise what we want to see, which is like kind of a equal weighting of the two different paths?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the commercial aspect is important to the project, and we need that commercial. And I think Care Drive would have been difficult to add commercial to that, but this property, the IP, we're talking 45 acres. If you can't add commercial to that and residential at the same time, then someone's not doing their job.
Yeah. Yeah, equal weighting to me
Right.
makes sense.
Right.
No, that,
I was just going to say that, as you said that, Bill, though, we were saying about teasing out the value of each one separately to be kind of equally weighted. However, if someone manages mixed use, they may be able to score on both sides, right?
Right.
And that-
Right.
It kind of
Yeah.
Right.
achieves,
Well-
it just clicked.
well, that's the
Sort of
thing,
pick
is
up on that,
it,
but-
it allows, it opens the door for any developer to say, how do I want to tailor my, my development of this property to give me the maximum opportunity to win the bid? That's,
Right.
knowing what our rubric is, that might be a mixed use, because they get to hit more components at a higher level if they can
Right.
do that. But it also gives, if we don't have a lot of people that want to do mixed use, it gives those that are strictly in the line of residential or strictly in commercial, it gives them equal weight. But it does give mixed use a priority.
Yeah.
Any other specific areas that are important that either of you think of right now that we want to make sure are part of it? I think Building 8 has been, I don't know why, but it's, for
It's
me,
intriguing.
it's
Yeah.
like something about Building 8's got to fit in the plan.
Yeah.
Whether it's just, it is for now and in the future something, but
Would you like to have it be a priority that Building 8 stay in some capacity? We can build that in. And then if no one wants to keep it, then they just don't score on that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing.
Right.
If we have it in there and it scores that way, but 0 developers want it, then they're all in the same level playing field. And,
right.
and
And
out
they-
it goes.
And they've told us what's
Right, they've told
what's
us what's-
viable, right?
Correct.
Right.
Would you like to see a priority for some kind of open space recreation to be included, or artwork in some capacity, public art?
I got to
I
think
don't
about that a
know
little
that-
bit.
I don't know that I would say off the cuff for me that I would give it a higher rating necessarily, knowing we have a lot of open space, we have a lot of conservation land and trails and parks in town already. So not that it's not important to the community, but we do have a strong base in my mind of that already. So I don't know that adding more to that makes sense to me as an advantage to the town.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's intriguing when I looked at it in different things, but I don't think I would want to weight that as something that would tip the scales for a developer.
If it fits in their design, that's not a negative, but it doesn't make it a exceptional positive for me right now.
No, I
Thinking
feel
about
the
it.
same
Yeah,
way.
and part of that, part of that response, I want to, temper a little bit because I really want to refamiliarize myself with all the different categories of the rubric. I haven't looked at it in a little while, and that's why I asked to have it sent, because when I say, I want to look at the entire package of what are we scoring, what are we ranking, what are the different components before I turn around and say I want this or this to be in there. I want to look at all of it and see how they play against each other, with each other, how they score out, and see, because I'm hesitant to create a rubric that is really gearing the rubric and advantageous to only one type of development. I'm hesitant to do that because I don't want to scare off developers that might have a really good vision that I don't see, and then I'm creating a pathway that, that I want, but maybe it's not viable.
I think I'm open to whatever whatever presents as the best option.
Yes.
Which means for me, there's no specific path that we have to define. We need to define something that will be long-term and successful and complementary. And I don't know that for me, going any further than that, although I know we need to find a way to grade them, makes sense without feeling like we are confining what may be presented. And I don't want to do that either. But I think in areas where we are measuring housing, I think having a portion of low income to help improve those goals of the town is important. So we need to have that context within housing specific type rubric measures. And I think on the other side, job creation and things like that, on the commercial side, industrial side, right?
Right.
Is maybe the two. Thinking of those two areas, that's what I think of as important pieces of those goals.
I agree.
Actually, one more question. So
Of
I know
course.
you talked about ranking a proposal higher if Building 8 was preserved. Do you have a requirement on any other building on this property? I mean, both proposals included Building 2, which has long been talked about as a building that potentially could be salvaged. Is that another programmatic requirement that you would like to see it reused, or is that something more in a grading rubric where you would rank that advantageous if the proposal included retaining it?
Well, I love building 2. I mean, the architecture inside of the building is phenomenal,
Right.
and lends to condo living and that style of architecture. But I'm afraid that there's no sides to the building. There's one whole side missing.
And they talked
when you
about that
start
in your
talking
proposal.
about structure and having to try to rebuild that,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's really feasible without some cost analysis.
It should, just for context, the official response that you received was informed by their architect who came for a second site visit to go through and see exactly what you're talking about. Those are serious considerations. And so I know that they were interested in several buildings, and we went all through that facility on multiple levels so that they could see the condition of the facility. And I have to assume that their response included that analysis from the architect about what could or could not, what made sense to be salvaged and restored. So I do believe, again, just based on the responses that you have, that Building 2 is a building that needs significant work, but it potentially could be salvaged.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at their financing conceptual sources, and they're talking just over 19 million in construction, which tells me that they're going to do substantial work to Building 2 to shore it up and use it. Their plan had Building 2 as their only building that they were going to keep. Right. So I think they, 19 million to construct reconstruct one
Renovate
building tells me that they understand
I think that's also a commitment to them keeping building 2. I think in the case
Right.
where they had, I don't know about RDI, they also proposed keeping it, RDI did. But if someone wanted to keep more of the complex, I don't know, would they be willing to sink that much money into keeping building 2? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either, but it would be a shame to see Building 2 go the way of demolition because it offers a lot. And you can see it when you walk through it inside, but it's going to come down to cost, clearly.
So, but I think that begs the question that
Right.
Brian was just asking. Do we want to craft the rubric that weighs a little more advantageous on keeping building 2 in whatever use they want to use it for?
Right.
You're really looking at I look at it 2 different ways. You talk about the architecture and the setup and design on the interior. I also look at it from an exterior architecture, and reuse. Just keeping that building in and of itself keeps the look and the feel of that industrial setting. So,
How about this? And so if I can add a couple thoughts. Out of all of them, other than 8, which is intriguing, I agree. Outside and inside, I think of high ceilings and the whole thing, right? However, when I look at, and I just happen to be looking at Community Builders map here, and I love what they've done with the green space, and it's a different look than what we've seen. But that building is so 90 degrees from what would be great, because if I had an apartment, I'd like to look at the river, not at the parking lot. And most of that building faces where you're going to have parking or the rear, which is okay in the back, but the way it's situated maybe doesn't fit more of the rural, residential use.
yeah, we talked about that
so-
when we did the walkthrough. You've only got a couple of apartments that'll look.
I know.
Those are the high-end
prime real
apartments.
estate.
Those are the prime.
Prime property.
Yeah, that's-
Those are
that's
a lot more expensive.
the
to rent
prime
those.
ones. So on that side, I think there's options, and we've seen some of the commercial industrial design options we've had from other
Yeah.
firms show us turning all the buildings, right, and having them run parallel instead of perpendicular to the river. So from that side, I am concerned if we put a priority in there, we may reduce the interest. What if the other thing was accessibility? So a lot of the other plans showed, a loop or a second access road that was not the tunnel anymore, and having the building restricts that ability to have an in and out or a circular route. That's maybe easy, especially for commercial use. So what if we had a priority for keeping at least half the building? Give them some option to maybe reduce the footprint of building 2. There's a priority to renovating some of building 2, at least 50 or 75% of it, which would give them an ability maybe to shorten it on the north side if that fit a different flow than what's there now. But still give some priority to keeping some of it. Because I agree with you, I think they said the most distinguished and usable structure in the community builders proposal. And I agree, if you look down there, that's the one that catches your eye. The rest of it is just there. But it was just a thought of a way to maybe have it as a priority without limiting too much the flexibility of a developer.
So the prioritization would be based on saving at least 50%?
Something like that. I'm
Something
just
like
kind of
that.
throwing it out there.
Yeah,
Maybe we don't
yeah.
have an answer tonight.
Yeah.
It's a lot to digest, but just a thought of.
That's a creative way of going about that, I think. Because I think you're right, the tunnel offers a restriction. It's an interesting feature, but it's a restriction. And I know Brian and I, when we did our first run through the proposal, looked at that. We originally proposed the access road on the south side of the building. Brian talked about they make those like the paver, like the structural grids that are drivable. I don't know if you've seen them, but basically like a structural grid that you can like plant on top of, and then you can drive over it and you don't get stuck in mud ruts, but it looks like lawn. They could potentially do something like that along the south side where it's fire access if they ever needed it, but it's not more like impervious surface that's always going to be there where you're looking out on an access road.
Right.
So I think that that's also a creative solution is, yeah, keeping part of the building. It could also be keeping the facade and building something entirely different behind it.
When you said the cost to rebuild, the other thought that went through my head is how well will it fit in with what's already there? I know they can do a lot, and I'm not saying that builders can't do amazing things, but you're adding on to a how many year old mill? Because it's an addition, right? Putting a new front wall, it's not there now. How will that change the character we see, right?
Right.
In a positive or negative way. How cohesive will it look to what's already there?
I think my gut feeling is that I'd like to see building 2 stay, if it's at all possible, and only those people who have a plan for it are going to know whether that works for them or not. I don't think I'd want to restrict how much of it they should use. I would say if they can, if they're footing the bill, if they can fix 100% of that building and keep it there, then keep it. But that's their option, 50 to 100% of that building, whatever is viable from a financial point of view.
Just want to throw out about the rubric. You talked about, advantageous or highly advantageous and different categories. Something like building 2, I would, if we have a 5-lane rubric, 5 category, maybe it's a 2 category. If you keep it, you get a point. If you don't, it's no point. And very simple. So it's not going to be such a high weight that if they don't keep the building, that all of a sudden they're at such a disadvantage that it doesn't even make sense to bid, because then you're going to eliminate bids that way. But if it's just a slight increase, which is over I don't know how many points we're going to end up looking at without having the rubric in front of me, but if it's a very slight advantage to keep building 2, then it's something that somebody who wants to get rid of building 2 can put together a really well thought out comprehensive plan that'll beat out anybody else's bid that's going to keep building 2, and we can look at that as well.
You could also make it, doesn't keep building 2, keeps 50% of building 2, keeps 100%. Like, you could make it what you want it to be.
Right. Yeah, I don't want to weight it in such a way that
It eliminates everyone else.
it eliminates everybody else. I really want to maximize the number of developers that see this and say, I could put together a plan for that site.
Yeah, I think that's a good thought, and I think that's also a good thought for any other small things that you don't want to be make or break, but you might want to see happen. You can still weight them to be advantageous, but they don't have to be worth a lot of points. So, I don't know. For example, building 8. Say you'd like to see building 8 stay, but it's not gonna make or break your decision. Maybe it's only worth 2 or 3 points if they keep it, and that way, like you said, if they choose not to, it's not like we're gonna throw out their whole proposal, but it's a little bump.
Right.
Maybe that's where both of them fit. I was thinking
Yeah,
of 8 when you said that, and
Yeah.
like you said, of lower weighting, maybe both of those criteria
I
fit
think
in
of
that.
most of the weighting on those, they should be a little bit, I don't want to put anything in there that is so highly advantageous that if a
You're not doing
developer
it, you're out.
doesn't have that in their repertoire, that they're just not going to bid, because they could be a phenomenal developer and have a great product for the town of Irving. But if we put something that's so highly advantageous, it's outside of their realm, then we're losing prospective developers.
I agree. Anything else at the moment for the rubric? I'm sure we'll have more as we read it and go through it.
Sure, there will be.
I'm
Okay.
all set. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you for all the
much.
hard work on these, and
Yeah,
exciting to keep moving it forward.
absolutely.
Oh, is there?
Don't go anywhere yet.
Okay, time to go home.
Not yet.
Not quite. Next item of business is discussion regarding the request for letter of support for Northfield Mountain and New England Trail protection. I'm gathering that you are going to kind of present the high level of that for us,
I can.
Mariah.
I met with Liam, who works for the Appalachian Mountain Club, a couple weeks ago, and they are currently talking with First Light and some other private landowners not just in Irving, but up and down the New England Trail. There is a large portion of that trail that is owned by private landowners, and they would really like to get as much of that under a conservation restriction as possible so that the trail can never be sold off where then you have a gap that you can't traverse. And so they are asking for a letter of support to pursue a conservation restriction with, I don't know if it's specific, one second, I'm pulling it up, what the exact wording is, but to promote, protect, and maintain the 4 miles of the New England Trail that passes through Irving.
So are they just looking for a letter of support?
Yep, there's a draft in your packet, and yeah, all they're looking for is a letter of support. They're doing all of the legwork of reaching out to landowners and having those negotiations and conversations, but they're rightfully so. Most landowners, it's a lot of state forest and First Light. They're saying, well, we'd like to know that the communities around us are also in support of this. So the Appalachian Mountain Club is just looking for you all to say, we would like to see this permanently conserved for hiking purposes and recreation purposes.
So I'm unfamiliar with the process. So, I see there's 2 private owners in there. Well, one DCR is not really a private owner. They're public. But that it leaves about 1.1 miles, which is most likely just residences that own so many 100 feet of frontage here and there. The impact of the negotiations they would be doing to do that, I want to know. I don't know enough about that, of what that looks like when that conservation process happens.
So a conservation restriction, and I'm not an expert on them, but it would require the landowner to participate in that. So it's not like eminent domain where they would be able to go in and do it. And it would be, I'm imagining Harry and Sue Sharbaugh own a section of the trail, my understanding, and they're in huge support of the trail, and they have signage on their property and everything. So if they chose to, they could then put a conservation restriction on that part, and if they ever sold their property, that property would still belong to them. It would still go with that land, but it would be perpetually open to the public.
I just wanted to make sure that's what they were looking for,
Yeah.
to do with it, and not something else. Like you said, eminent domain to
Right.
force.
They're not taking any land.
Yeah.
It would still belong to whatever
Okay.
landowner it currently owns it, unless they opted to ever buy it. But yeah, all it is we have other conservation restrictions in town. So if you imagine Poplar Mountain Conservation Area, it's permanently protected for wildlife and recreation.
So they're looking for support before they bother meeting with landowners to even have these discussions.
Right. And they've already begun meeting with them. And this is kind of a simultaneous, they would like your support to be able to say that the town is in support of this.
Okay.
Probably get critical mass behind all the towns and areas that they're
Yeah.
going, right? So it's more of like a restricted right-of-way covering the trail as opposed to a parcel.
Right.
They're more looking to restrict a portion of a property.
It would
Where the
be,
trail
I think, a
passes.
certain number of feet from the current trail. So maybe it's 25 feet wide or something.
Sure.
Oh, Jake, you crafted a really nice letter in there.
I have really good
It was
writers.
already
That's what I'm going to say. All the credit to the writers and the Appalachian Club, who probably helped as well.
Yes.
Some great sayings about outdoors. Any other questions or concerns?
No, I have no
For or
concerns.
against?
I'm in favor of protecting our trails any way we can, so.
Well, it's my name on it, so I'll make a motion that we authorize the chair to sign the letter of support in the Appalachian Mountain Club's efforts to promote and protect the 4 miles of the New England National Scenic Trail that passes through Irving.
I'll second that.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Is that my last agenda item?
That is,
Before I run away.
Yes, thank you, Mariah. Next item is review of the draft special town meeting warrant.
I did, yeah. One of those moments.
Okay. So
That's
you
not
all-
very short. I'm just going to start that. That STM warrant is pretty long.
Well, so here's the thing, I was looking at it.
It's a draft. I understand. We can
Yes,
pull things in and out, but it's a
Yeah,
lot there.
it's not small.
not at all.
And these are all the things that you all have been working on for the last few months, that every time we talked about it, if we said, okay, that'll go to a town meeting, I've been putting in the folder. And so here's your first draft of everything that we've been talking about for months.
Right.
So you have your normal articles that you would typically expect at your winter STM, which would be your bills of a prior year, and any other financial articles that we need to do. The one financial article that I'd like to recommend to you is to move the $544,000 that you received from the MBLC back in June, put that in stabilization. That's part of that ongoing commitment that you all have with the voters when you use the money for the library project. So those are your first two articles.
Before you move on,
Yeah.
we still have a ways to go on the lead certification potential funding, right?
Correct.
Coming back.
Maybe by April.
Okay. I'm just thinking as we're talking about the library stabilization article. What about the balance in the solar article? Is that at a point, I know we've had some questions around the solar, is that at a point where that might be something, there's a significant balance there to transfer back
There
as
is.
well?
Correct.
I'm just thinking of combining them. We could always wait till annual, but if we know already and it's there,
Correct.
maybe
I
it
agree.
makes sense to
Yeah.
put it together.
So you'd like to see an article that deals with closing out the solar array
Yeah.
fund?
Yes.
Okay.
And we would want to put it back in general stabilization, put
Yeah.
it back where, you know, to keep paying back this borrowing, self-borrowing. Okay. And this is the last payment, right?
This is the last MBLC payment.
From MBLC, right?
I think we have two more that you committed to. I have to go back and check my records.
Right.
Because you've also been making an annual contribution back in the stabilization as well. I don't know how that changes with restoring, like you said, a significant amount of money for the solar array back into that fund. It's over $100,000 that you have left in that fund, so.
I'm going to change the last pay back balance
Yeah, there you go.
as we get there.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so.
Thank you.
So I will draft that for your next review. Okay, the next four are the public ways that we've been working on. So you have the extension of Care Drive, the acceptance for the first time of Public Works Boulevard, the relocation of Highland Avenue, and this is addressing two issues. This is that little extension of 247 square feet at the very top you met with Mr. Pollard. He knows that we've been waiting for this special town meeting, so here's that article. But this is also dealing with the recording of this road layout in the 1970s was not done all the way through the process. So we're taking this opportunity to readopt all of Highland Avenue. It's all the existing meets and bounds with that one change with Mr. Pollard. And then we will finish the recording correctly this time. And then Pleasant Street layout is the one that you all reviewed at your last meeting.
Yeah.
Any concerns with those?
I don't have any.
I don't have any
No.
concerns with those.
Okay.
Well, I have a question.
Yes.
Poplar Mountain. We're a ways away from that one, right?
I mean,
Because we got to go through the whole process of getting it signed over to us from the
and I may be
FERCog
able to get
potentially.
that done by January, so it may not be that unrealistic. He's out there doing it now, so if you'd like me to do put a placeholder article in here for it, I can do that for you.
I think at the end we're all going to talk about how unwieldy this is as a special or not by the number of articles. However, when it's groups of very similar articles that all have the same conversation, I don't know if that is problematic. So that's where the question comes from. I don't know if we'd put it on there, but if it's ready, we'd at least consider it, right? If we're talking road layouts. I mean,
So, I was going to say, as a general, rule, I like to minimize what we're putting on an STM, and I'd rather move as much as I can to an ATM. So, I mean, that's just, I look at all of one of the comments I was going to make is how many of these zoning changes are time sensitive where getting them on an STM makes sense, and how many of those can push back a few extra months into an ATM in the spring. And I know I get the logic between grouping them all together, but a lot of it's very cumbersome. There is a lot of language in there, and to
they're
ask,
complex.
and we don't get the same turnout at an STM than we do at an ATM. It's not tremendous, the difference, but I have heard in the past people saying when you have large changes like this that are outside of the norm of your general operating stuff that happens, the ATM is the way to go, because you do maximize the number of residents that get involved. Having said that, if there are any of these items that are time sensitive, then you can make a case for why we would put them on an STM. So I would use that on any one of them as a standard for why I would or wouldn't put it on there.
Can I offer
So
just
maybe, go ahead.
just want to offer 2 points? Because you all have had that conversation throughout the years, and I know that the three of you are very concerned about that. As we were putting together our review from some of the zoning changes, I had to dig through the Old Town reports. The zoning changes in the last 20 years have predominantly been made at special town meetings. So it's not outside of the norm for how you've conducted it in the past, but those concerns obviously are real. The other thing I just wanted to remind you all is that you all have decided over the last several years to go further with your public notification process than most towns would. So it's not just the posting, you mail this to every residence in town. So, so if that helps.
So what I was going to say is, why don't you go ahead and go through them, and I'll stop interrupting you, and then
No, you're not interrupting me at all.
and then why don't we come back with that eye of what's time sensitive? Because I look at it and I think maybe 2/3 of it is, maybe half of it is,
Yeah,
but maybe not all of it, and that's a fair point. And some of these are extremely lengthy language about what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
That are complex, and while they may be simple concepts, what's in there is a lot to digest. So maybe it doesn't, if we don't need to put them in especially, I get where you're going with that.
Yeah.
So maybe, why don't you go ahead and go through the rest of them, Brian, make sure there's no questions about what they are, and then we can talk about what makes sense.
Of course.
Mariah? You may.
For the zoning, one of the requirements is that if a town meeting fails to vote to adopt a zoning proposal within 6 months after the hearing by the planning board, no action can be taken on that proposal until after another notice and public hearing and report. So you have 2 public hearings, one in November and one in December. So that would mean May and June would be the end dates for those 2. Before, not that they couldn't have another public hearing, but we'd have to go through the process again.
So the
Okay,
anticipated
I
date
missed
of
that.
the annual.
So from the earliest hearing, what is the 6-month date?
May.
It would be May 18th.
somewhere around there.
But our ATM is
It's like May
May
11th.
11th. It is
Okay.
before that. Within days. I believe we should verify that, right, in making this decision, but I believe we are within days of meeting the
Correct.
requirement
Okay.
from the hearing.
Yeah.
Thank you. But yes, it's tight, but I think we did time that so that we could put it on either, if we wanted to.
May 11th, you're talking annual.
Annual.
Just double.
Right, and so Mariah's point was there's a 6-month window from the public hearing till it has to be voted on, or you can't take any action. I believe, and we'll have the team verify that the 6-month window would encompass the annual town meeting by a few days. I think we've just a
by
couple
one
days.
week. Yeah.
Yeah,
By 1 week.
to make it fit.
Okay.
So we're okay there if we do delay
Correct.
Yeah.
for that reason. All right, Brian, go ahead. You were on street layouts.
So
Or
any
you'd finish.
concerns about the ones that you all have reviewed?
No.
No.
And do you want me to do a placeholder for Poplar Mountain, assuming that Ed can get that to you? I know
We
he's
have to
working on
draft it either way, so we'll draft it. Whether it goes on the STM or not, we'll
Right,
let you
right.
know as we
Yeah.
figure that out.
Okay.
As a separate topic
Okay.
here.
So the next one is the Mosquito Control District, and this was a hot topic that you addressed back in the summer. There were several residents that came to you and were concerned about the Mosquito Control Board's actions on the state level and wanting to have local control. We tried our opt-out application, that was not successful. And the only other way that you can address this is to be part of a mosquito control district. Those are all created by special legislation, so there is one for our region, it's the Pioneer Valley region. Several of our neighbors joined over the summer when they had an opportunity to add an article like this to their annual or special town meetings. So you have to have a town meeting vote to authorize the select board to join, and then there is an annual appropriation. I have reached out to them just to remind me the exact amount. My brain's telling me it's $5,000 a year to
I
join.
thought it was around 5,000.
And we have that in the Board of Health budget, and we would budget going forward to make sure that that's an additional line item if you chose to go forward with this. So in terms of being time sensitive, it could be on the annual, it could be on the special. It does take some time to get this all into motion, and I know that the residents who were concerned last time will be concerned again this summer. So I put it on this one.
So would you change that article to reflect the cost?
I can if you'd like me to.
Yeah, I think we should.
So, and to appropriate $5,000 from free cash?
Whatever that amount is. yeah.
Okay.
If we have it in the health department budget, we may at least want to just in the article information call out that there is an annual cost, right?
Yeah.
Even if we already have the funding in the health budget.
Right.
Maybe we don't need free cash money this year, but
Right.
we'll see it in next year's budgeting and we would see it just to notify that there's a cost to join. It's not a free service. Right?
I should have an answer from the director of this program this week. And so as soon as I know, I'll make sure I get it to the three of you.
And if you could, Brian, on the article information,
Yep.
if you could add 2 or 3 sentences about what you just talked about,
Yep.
because I know we've tried over the years to get really informative on what that article information is, and I think people, while there are a select few that would see this and not need any clarification on why we would be doing it and what the purpose is,
Others will need.
a large number of our residents would probably look at this and say, I have no idea what this is or why we do it. And
Yeah. I'll revise the article information. If I do track changes in this so that you can see what
Sure.
changed from this version, would that be helpful?
yes,
Okay. Okay. Then you have the zoning bylaw amendments. There's four proposed articles. One is the,
real
You
property.
skipped the real property transactions. Wow. This is what I did last meeting. I was skipping all kinds of
Yeah.
items. So.
you were absolutely right, I skipped 2 by accident, real property. So this is to accomplish 2 tasks. The first one is to seek authorization from the citizens to surplus 17 Moore Street. And that was the conversation that the 3 of you have been having over the last month. In case you have a proposal that comes forward as you're selling the 18 Pleasant Street property that you want to entertain, we do need town meeting authorization. So that article would give you that, and it's the language that we used for 18 Pleasant Street. So the second is the acquisition of a easement, and it's going to sound a little silly, but it's probably about 4 square feet that we're securing. We have a very kind property owner that was willing to work with us to put in the pedestrian crossings, but it was right up against the layout, and he was okay with the sonotube being installed on the corner of his property. So we're just trying to secure
Oh, is this
that
the one on the
maintenance.
corner of,
Pratt and Lester.
yeah.
He was very kind to work with us on this, but as we've learned, we need to be good about documenting any easements that we have, responsibilities that we have on private property. And so this would be just to secure our rights to maintain and keep that equipment in good condition, or remove it if you so choose.
Yeah, I was reading that, thinking up and down Pratt. I'm like,
what did
our layout is wide enough. I don't know why we would have to go. We don't need an
It's
easement
Leicester
anywhere,
Street.
but it's just on that corner of
Yeah.
Leicester where
Which side is it?
Leicester, on the corner of Leicester and Pratt.
Is it like the northerly?
I think it's 2
Is it
Pratt
this
Street.
side where we are of it?
No, it's on the
Other side?
The other side.
It's the other side, the downhill,
Downhill
With
side?
the rock
Okay.
wall.
the downhill side.
Southish side?
right.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
got it.
And it's
Yeah.
and that very little corner there, it does become tight with the backside of the sidewalk, and so where this had to be placed, like I
Yeah.
said, he was kind enough to work
I
with us.
think you're
kept
talking like,
picturing
what, a foot?
Yeah, it's not much.
It's not much.
No,
2 square feet.
yeah,
I was picturing the corner of Pratt, the sharp corner where we've just put sidewalks
Oh,
and
yeah,
crossings,
yeah,
and
the-
wondering if we were
yeah.
thinking about a crossing there
no.
or a flasher there. Okay.
Well,
Anyway.
even if we, that's what I'm saying, all along
The rest
Pratt,
of the
the
layout's
rest of it,
wide, right?
the rest of the layout
Yeah.
is, 2 or 3 feet beyond the sidewalk, so you have plenty
Right,
of space to
right.
put in these,
That's fine.
Gotcha.
Leicester's tight. Yeah.
Leicester's tight.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Does that make sense to include? Again, that one's not particularly time sensitive, but it's a small issue, and it just cleans up the project from last spring. Okay. So now to zoning. These are the 4 that you've been talking about with the planning board and with Mariah. So this is to add the proposed section 8.3. That's the proposed planned unit development overlay, the PUD, and all the language that comes along with that designation. The definitions that you talked about in section 6 specifically, this is the one to update multi-units to be 3 or more units and remove the cap on 4 and to change family to the word unit.
That's the next one, the second zoning one.
Correct.
Okay.
The third article underneath zoning is to update your use table. That's specifically to support the planning board and their request or their recommendation to make special permit options available for multi-dwelling in all the zones and to make 2 units available by right in all zones. Those are the only 2 changes that we were making to the use table at this time.
Which goes hand in hand with the one before.
Correct. Correct. And the final article under the zoning section was to update the official zoning map. And that takes care of the variety of zone changes when you had your joint meeting with the planning board. For instance, transitioning CV to this property, the creation of the PUD zones throughout town, and a couple places where, like on Gunn Street, you shifted CV back to the commercial property and VR to the residential properties. So to adopt those changes, that article is necessary.
So 1 and 4 are kind of tied together, and the second and third are kind of tied
Correct.
together. If you want to pair them off.
Correct. And Mariah and I we were putting these articles together and trying to make sure that we got the wording correct. And this is informed by the last time we did zoning updates back in 2018. So I definitely want to sit with council and make sure I've made it as clean as possible. We were trying to think of the presentation. There's a little strategy with how you present these things. If you adopt one but you don't adopt the second one, things don't happen. So there should be some logical order to the way that you present some of this. And so if the PUD bylaw amendment doesn't change, it's not approved, it's not adopted, then why adopt the updated zoning map
Right.
with the overlay districts on it?
Right.
So if you would like us to reorganize that, we absolutely can, but that was our first attempt. And the way we did the 2018 zoning changes were to put the exact language of the bylaw today. So that's why it's as many pages as you saw. And then specifically call out the changes. So the changes are in italics of what's being added, and what's being deleted or proposed for deletion is, I think, in brackets and underlined.
Okay. So, I'm just a anecdotal question. Is the table of contents new?
We did it for the annual, and I didn't know if
I
people
didn't
liked
recall. I like it. I'm
Okay.
reading it, liking it. I don't know what you two thought. I didn't recall having it in the annual, but that's okay.
it. Yeah, that was the first time I think we did it.
It's not really a critical comment. In terms of, do we want all this in a special? Do we want to push some out? I guess if we did want to shorten it, if possible, when I looked through the list, I was thinking the stabilization fund article, while nice to get done, is not necessary to do it a special, moving that money back into the stabilization. However, it's less time gaining interest. That's the only downside, right, of delaying. Prior year expenses, obviously, we should clean those up Public ways, we have a property owner in Highland Ave who's waiting for this to complete patiently. Does the extension of Care Drive, is anything around, that's primarily focused around senior housing future, right?
Yep.
I don't think we're going to be at somewhere closer to that before May
Correct.
or before July 1st where we would need it in place.
Right.
Although we want to do it, I don't think it's
Right.
maybe time-wise driven from that.
Right.
Public Works, maybe helpful if we do something with the Public Works facility, but we are far from funding it or deciding what we're doing, so I don't think that's, I mean, that's not helping our Chapter 90, but again, that only is going to help us on July 1 anyway, right?
Correct.
So, Pleasant Street, I don't know that that's, doesn't really have any time sensitivity to it either, does it?
We're just cleaning up another, yep.
17 more is important if we receive proposals that make us want to go that route.
Right.
Pratt is cleaning it up, but again, it's not time sensitive necessarily, as long as the property owner is not concerned,
Correct.
which it didn't seem to be.
No.
And zoning, I guess my questions around zoning, the plan use development could be beneficial or complementary to our International Paper Mill RFP process. And if we do think we're going to do something in the next couple months, it would be maybe more advantageous to have that in place as opposed to in the works we hope approved. Maybe. Knowing it's in the works doesn't hurt, but knowing it's approved and in place might be that much better. And I think the same, like we've already talked about the same for the second and third zoning pieces, which are allowing beyond 4 multi-unit, which complements our property surplus that we're working on the RFP right now for the
Correct.
former school.
Correct.
So anyway, that's how I look at them with your thoughts in mind, Scott.
Yeah, so looking at all the categories,
Oh, I skipped mosquitoes.
no, it's fine. 'Cause so what I was really referring to was the zoning. And the 4 zoning really need to be on there.
I agree.
Right. No,
So,
I hear you.
so when I had said, it was the reference was for zoning bylaw changes. However, these 4 are time sensitive, and so, and they're bulky, and I wish they weren't time sensitive. And I would say put them on there. I would say put them on there if they're time sensitive, which they are. So I appreciate your,
Just running through with that
going
thought
through and
process.
looking at them. To me, it doesn't make sense if we're going to look at any one public way, just look at all of them, because they're, like you said, they're, once you get flowing, they see one and they're like, oh, I know what this is. I just voted on this 30 seconds ago. Let's vote on the next one. Move on. So I appreciate you looking at it, but after going through it all and looking at them, I wouldn't recommend taking them off.
Okay. I do
Sorry
agree
to
with
make you go
Brian,
through
though
all
I
that
feel
work.
like, and you pulled the data, but I do recall some zoning amendments that were specifically, I almost feel like targeted at a special because it was focused on just doing that. So it wasn't distracted by
Yeah.
the rest of an annual town meeting, which has its pros and cons.
Yeah.
I've heard the same from residents in both directions.
Yeah. It's not this is where it gets interesting. Personally, it's not a concern of me. It is what a special town meeting is for. It's for your not everyday items. Your annual is typically your operating budget and your overarching operation of the town. Specials are for this. I've just heard the concern throughout the years, and it's not a large number of residents, but there are residents that say, why do we put big topics on special town meeting when we don't get as many residents participating? So that's where that comment came from. But the purpose of the special town meeting is for all of the other nuanced operations that are not your standard annual,
Process. Yeah.
process and budgetary, and so.
I will also say, at least in my experience, I've heard the same stuff from residents, in a minority, of course.
Yeah.
But we've had, and I think you've been at some of them, you probably have too, either at this table or not, we've had specials where we've had 1 or 2 articles and we've filled the room
Yeah.
well beyond what you would have expected drove attendance at the annual by itself, right?
Right.
For one topic. So I do think people will come if they are
Yeah.
concerned or passionate
Right.
about what's on it. So
I just wanted to voice it. I don't have a concern with the way it's constructed, but I did want to get that out there, that I've heard it over the years.
So I have a question on the residential uses.
Okay.
It says single-family, two-family, multi-unit dwelling. So what we're talking about at the IP paper mill, is that where that would fall under, multi-unit dwelling?
Correct.
Okay,
Yep.
all right.
And in the way that the planning board has proposed it to you and you proposed it back to them was special permit.
Okay.
Yep.
and the only other change in the residential there was moving 2-family to by right as opposed to special permit, right? In the rest of all the zones. Well, other than just refining some language and checking on some stuff, and we can decide whether Poplar Mountain ends up in there or not if it's
Yeah.
ready. I guess the only other thing is timing. And maybe we're not ready to set timing, but
No.
I wasn't expecting that either. I think we just wanted to make sure that you saw the language, and if you had concerns about the language or the types of articles, know that now, so that we could do whatever work you needed done. But this can go right back in the folder where the other articles have lived for the last few months. And when
Well-
you say you're ready, then we can schedule it.
that's fine. And I'm not saying we need to commit to a date tonight, but I think we should probably try to firm one up at the next meeting.
Yeah,
If
I was going to
the rest
say.
of the board's ready, because
agree.
if we're talking about putting out an RFP in January potentially, or even if it's early February, it'd be nice to have this in the first addenda if it wasn't in the RFP that these were adopted. And the former school building is probably more timely. I don't recall what we moved the extension to.
I want to say it's January 24th
I was
or
going to say
January
the end of
27th.
January.
Right. And we have already said, I'm sure, that we've been considering a change. And maybe we won't issue an update that says it's adopted in time, but we would want to know that it is by the time we're reviewing and deciding on a proposal to make sure it's feasible,
Yes.
Agree.
at least through a special permit process. So I know, to me, it lends to January, I guess, is somewhere probably in that time frame. So
Yep.
can take a look and kind of firm something up next meeting.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen, for looking at that.
January.
Yep.
So I will have a revised draft for December 13th.
Great.
Perfect.
Next item of business is a planning board resignation. We unfortunately have a letter of resignation from George Moonlight Davis from the planning board. He regretfully can no longer serve for personal reasons, effective here in November, so we will have a vacancy now. I want to thank him for his many years serving there and wish him well. Hopefully, maybe he can return at some point in the future. So the planning board is aware. I believe he announced it at the last meeting that they held, if I recall correctly. So we will begin the advertisement process again and put it out that it's available.
Okay. Would you like me to plan for a deadline in January? I've missed the around town opportunity to advertise.
I think with all the holidays and everything, it probably makes sense too.
Yeah.
Sometime in January that makes sense
Yeah.
for the deadline, and then we'll put it onto an agenda following.
You got it.
How many members are currently on the board?
4.
4. So that leaves them at 3.
Correct.
We had just, maybe a month or two ago filled the vacancy
Right.
that there was, and now there's another.
And
So
if one
Correct.
person has to bow out, then they don't have a quorum.
They
That's
don't
the
have,
concern.
they'll have a quorum, but they won't have a supermajority if they have a certain issue. right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So
But it's
three
tight.
will be quorum, but yeah, it's not
Yeah.
ideal.
Right.
And they've got a lot of work they're doing, so
Right.
full board would be preferred.
So we'll draft that. We'll get that out as soon as possible. We'll include it in the January around town, and I'll give a mid-January date.
Yeah.
So we've covered all our bases legally. Gets us through the holidays.
Okay.
Okay. With that wraps our planned business. Is there any other items from the board for tonight, or Brian?
I can't think of anything.
No, I've got nothing.
Okay, our next meeting is Monday, December 13th. We'll be here at 6:30 PM again.
Yes, sir.
And with that, I'll make a motion to adjourn at 8:32 PM.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. We'll see you in a couple weeks.